All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, a ZPAP M70 chambered in 7.62x3.9. Now, eagle-eye viewers of the channel will note that I have already reviewed this rifle. This is an update video. So if you're looking for all the nitty-gritty background and why it is that I picked the different things that I did to be able to put on this rifle, go ahead and check the link in the description to the original video. Now, for everybody else, we will be going over this rifle and how my opinions might have changed over time, address a lot of things out of the comments section from the previous video, as well as put this video kind of back, or reframe this video in my current filming pattern. I've kind of changed some things since the first time that I reviewed this rifle. All right, guys, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into a, I guess, like reframing or rescoping of the history portion of this. Now, first off, guys, if you're not interested in the history aspect of this, I get it. I completely understand. Go ahead, check the description. I have chapters laid out there. You'll go ahead and be able to jump to whatever content it is that you do actually want to consume. For everybody else, there's a couple things that I want to keep in mind. This is the rescoping thing here. I discuss history on this channel because I find it interesting. I enjoy kind of painting the picture, framing the overall discussion, what it is that was going on at the time when a rifle was developed. And I try not to go too far down it. I try to, go like maybe one model adjacent or something like that to kind of build the picture for what it is that we're getting into, where trends were going at the time, where doctrine was at the time, if we're talking about military rifles or something along that line. This is not a history channel, and this is also not a geopolitical channel. I did not major in geopolitics. I didn't major in anything. I haven't been to college, so... This is entirely just because I find it interesting, which is really kind of the basis of the entire channel. I find things interesting. I hop on my YouTube platform and I discuss these types of things. This is not meant to be in-depth nitty-gritty on history and all that kind of stuff. So people who get in there and get in the comment section and are upset that I didn't accurately frame something, or I didn't accurately enough frame something, or get into some nitty-gritty type thing, okay, I understand, and I appreciate... Sometimes I appreciate the addition that it brings to the conversation, but also sometimes maybe we get a little bit too far down that rabbit hole of history and it has absolutely nothing to do with the thing that we're talking about, with the actual purpose of the video. So, with that, I want to go ahead and address, having had this whole long thing about how this isn't a history channel and I don't know anything about geopolitics, I do have some firsthand experience with geopolitics, so I want to kind of rescope the conversation a little bit. So somebody mentioned in the comment section that, like, well, there are a lot of countries that weren't a part of the USSR, that were a part of the Warsaw Pact, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, that, got the technical data package for the AK. It wasn't exactly a secret or anything along those lines. And that is really mischaracterizing the conversation quite a bit there, actually. So the USSR was a country of Russia and a whole bunch of, like, princedoms that it took over the years and stuff like that. So, like, there were many ethnic groups in the USSR, like, I don't know, Ukraine, Belarus, all that kind of stuff. These were not ethnically Russian, but they didn't necessarily have their own countries at the time. You could still draw ethnic boundaries and all that kind of stuff. And that's how, when the USSR broke up, a lot of those countries formed into countries based off of those ethnic boundaries, which is a lot better than just drawing random lines on the map and saying, this is Pakistan now, Great Britain. So, with that being the case, there were countries that were members of the Soviet Union, members of the Warsaw Pact, that were not in the USSR. Poland, East Germany, Bulgaria, so on and so forth. But that does not mean that these were as independent of a nation as you might think. They were sovereign nations, but Russia was calling the shots. And that's a big thing you have to remember about the Soviet Union, was if Russia didn't like it, it was going to change. It was going to change very rapidly, and that's not unusual for a superpower to kind of behave in that manner. The U.S. has plenty of instances of doing the same type of thing. In no way am I necessarily leveraging full criticism at Russia in this case, other than to say that in the current trend of things, they're maybe a little bit more violent than others are. That, let's get down a rabbit hole. Let's get back on track here. So, yes, Poland and all these different countries, they were separate, but they're, in a lot of ways, those governments were proxy governments or puppet governments. Just because they were sovereign does not mean that they had all the say in all of the things. So, and Russia did not have an issue with flexing that whenever it is that they felt that they needed to. So while these countries had the ability to be able to develop their own weapon systems, and I'm sure this extends in other things, but this is a firearms channel, so that's what we're going to linger on. They could develop their own munitions, their own weapon systems and stuff like that. However, it was still expected that they would be in line with everybody else so that they could be mutually supporting should World War III kick off. So having guns and howitzers and all that kind of stuff chambered in the same things so that they could interchange munitions if needed, but there would still be some one-offs. One of the great things about having this type of union, though, was when a technical data package, when Russia, the USSR, developed a new technical data package, it was something that they could easily transfer to other people so that those people didn't have to necessarily go through the process of trying to develop the same, because small arms aren't necessarily the hardest things to come up with. A lot of R&D still goes into them, and there's still innovation and stuff like that in the field. But when you're talking about tank development, helicopters, jets, all that kind of stuff, like that takes a lot of effort. That takes a lot of time, money, education, all those types of things. So that's why you don't necessarily see like a whole lot of homegrown jet designs in the former Soviet Union, but you do see a lot of MiGs. So, Poland didn't necessarily have its own like designation or like its own fighter jet program or anything along those lines. I guess fighter jet would be the proper way to say that. Fighter jet program, but they still had jets. Now, during all this development process in the former Soviet Union, you would see some people get none too gently reminded that they needed to toe the line. So, Russia and, Warsaw Pact, everything gets formed, and they're like, hey, the USSR, Russia is like, hey, it'd be really great if we all used like the same gun, like the same chambering. So we came up with the 7.62x39, like right there at the end of World War II. It's pretty neat. We think it's pretty cool, and we think everyone should use it. And everyone was like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. Give us the technical data packages, and we'll start producing the guns and the chamberings and all that kind of stuff. Everyone but Czechoslovakia, who was like, yeah, but we developed the 7.62x45, which is 6 millimeters longer, so it's better. And Russia's like, yo, dude, maybe it would be really neat if you got online with everybody else and did the 7.62x39 thing. And Czechoslovakia is like, wait, or stay with me here. You guys chamber the 7.62x45 because it's 6 millimeters longer, so therefore better. And Russia was like, yeah, no. Okay, now I'm telling you, rechamber your guns at 7.62x39. So they would take their VZ-52 and their machine guns and stuff like that, rechamber 7.62x39, and eventually develop the CZ-58, which looks like an AK, but is in no way similar to an AK, won't even take the magazines, but at least runs the same chambering. And they kind of, Czechoslovakia kind of grumbled to itself, like, fine, well, we're developing a new handgun, it's going to be chambered 9mm Luger. And Russia's like, Makarov or 7.62x25. Anyway. Now, in addition to this whole, like, Russia had a lot of say in what was going on in other countries, when Czechoslovakia started approaching the idea of maybe leaving the Soviet Union, dropping out of the Warsaw Pact and all that kind of stuff, Russia took offense real fast because, as it turns out, Czechoslovakia shared a border with NATO, and that could potentially compromise the safety of the USSR. And that is one thing Russia's always been a very big fan of, is having a buffer zone between it and its enemies, because it has been pillaged several times in history now, and they are fed up with it. We see that same thing now. So they would wind up occupying Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia would conduct a bloodless revolution, which was not bloodless. It was bloodless in the terms of Czechoslovakia did not take up arms against the occupiers, but a lot of Czech citizens died in the process. So that's kind of an example there. In addition to that, when we talk about like puppet governments and stuff like that, this is something that Russia still does. Like at one point, the former president of Ukraine was more or less in Putin's pocket, and then he was ousted, and this kind of started this whole thing with like the invasion of Crimea and then ultimately the war in Ukraine. Like Russia has a tendency to really try to lean very heavily on its neighbors in order to be able to influence what's going on for the betterment of Russia. All right, so yes, getting back on track here, Poland and Bulgaria and all that kind of stuff got the technical data packages for the AK and the AKM, and they would make minor changes to it in order to better suit their overall needs. Yugoslavia was not a part, it's coming full circle here, Yugoslavia was not a part of the Soviet Union. They were communists, but they were not member states. And they're not the only ones who did this type of thing. China was also not a member of the Soviet Union. And this at times put them at odds with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, and other times relations were good. And it's the same ebb and flow that you have between countries, regardless of what their economic affiliation is, be it capitalist or communist. It doesn't really matter. So when times were good, Yugoslavia was like, hey, we're really friendly right now. Maybe we get some SKS stuff. And Russia was like, you know what? You can have all the SKS tooling and technical data package. We're kind of done with it. And that's where we get the M59 and eventually the M59-66 Yugoslavian SKSs. And the Yugos would take that machining, and they would actually wind up making some changes to better suit those rifles to their needs. They did not get the same consideration when it came time for the AK and the AKM. At that point, relations had soured, and they would not get the technical data package. So how do we get to this rifle? Well, Yugoslavia would capture an Albanian patrol that wandered across their border, and that is when they would first come into direct contact with the AKM. They decided that they thought it was pretty sweet, and they were completely fine with starting to produce it, and then bingo, bango, bongo, we eventually wind up with the M70. So this was not a licensed copy. They did not receive the technical data package. They reverse engineered it, much like the Chinese did with the Type 56. Now, something that was mentioned in the other comment section for the other video was that I spent too much time referring to different pieces and portions of this rifle as standard AK. Now, I would say something like the handguard is standard AK, and then I would go into a discussion about how it's different than an AK, and I can understand how that's a little confusing. Allow me to clarify this. Absolutely, this rifle is very different from an AK, but it doesn't look like it. And that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about the Yugoslavian AKs and now Serbian AKs. At first glance, especially to just the casual, somebody who knows that AKs exist, they look at it and go, oh yeah, that's an AK. And they're not wrong, but they kind of are. Even somebody who is fairly versed in firearms might look at this and go, oh, that's an AK. Oh wait, it's a Yugo. And then they would understand why it is that's important. They would be able to pick out the things that indicate that this is not your standard AK-47. But this is probably the most AK-looking variant. AK-looking AK variant, I guess is the best way to say that. It has a wood handguard. It has very, the overall layout, the manual arms, all that kind of stuff is exactly like an AK. It's just different enough to not be able to accept a lot of the pieces and parts. The only other example that would be closer than this, that is still technically a variant, would be the Type 56. This is not so different as a Valmet or a Galil, where the average person would look at those and think there's something, have a completely different classification, when in fact, they are AKs. They have AK receivers, they just have a whole bunch of other parts changed that also don't make them compatible with standard AK and AKM parts, but they are drastically different. Oh, this has, some differences like a 3-slot handguard, just like the M59-66 had. But it's still in standard configuration made out of wood. It's just slightly longer and has a little bit more airflow for cooling it down. It doesn't really change anything about the function of the rifle other than I can grip it more, I can grip it a little bit further out, which when these rifles were first developed wasn't considered to be that big of a deal or an advantage. So yes, I am technically wrong in referring to things as standard AK, but you could understand why there's really not that much difference between this and an AK. It is so minor, it's so minutia. Now, exportation of these rifles. Yugoslavia would wind up exporting the M70, and they would send them to the Middle East, they would go into Africa, and most notably, they would wind up in Iraq. And somebody was like, no. So in the previous comment section, someone was like, no, Saddam just saw the M70 and was like, that's a good rifle, let's start building it. But no, Iraq actually purchased the technical data package, the licensing, all that kind of stuff to be able to produce these rifles. They didn't just export to them. They started producing them themselves, licensed by Zastava from the Yugoslavian government. And that's how we get the Tabuk designated marksman's rifle, which is a pretty cool adaptation of this particular rifle. Now, someone also said that I was remiss in bringing up Mitchell's Mausers when it came to U.S. importation. And they're absolutely right, because I always forget that Mitchell's Mausers even existed. I was very young when Mitchell's Mausers was still in business, so they weren't really like on my radar, minus seeing ads for them in like firearms magazines and stuff like that, Shotgun News, all that kind of thing. Mitchell's Mausers is most notably known for the importation of Mausers, be them Yugoslavian Mausers or K98s that were coming out of Eastern Europe from, whatever deep war storage that they were coming out of. And they were actually the topic of much debate as to, first off, whether or not the actual value was there, because many of the rifles were force matched on the serial numbers with their parts. Some of them were reblued, some of them were restocked, and then also there were some safety concerns for those same rifles. If somebody just swapped in a random bolt and then force matched it with the rest of the rifle, did they actually check headspace or anything along those lines? Now, I think a lot of the force matching and rebluing for those rifles were probably conducted in whatever country they came out of, either prior to going into storage or as they were coming out of storage. Either way, there's a lot of debate. I don't want to get into the topic too deep of Mitchell's Mausers. There's other people who've done videos covering that. Nothing Fancy did one specifically. But I do think it is worthwhile to note that the original importation of Yugoslavian AKs came in through Mitchell's Mausers, and there were no complaints with those that I could find, because they were more recently produced firearms from, not war stocks and stuff like that. So now, of course, there would be some importation, like some assault weapons bans and stuff like that going on in that time period that would complicate flow, and then Mitchell's Mausers would eventually go away. So now these rifles have come in through Century Arms and now are actually imported by Zastava into the US, which is pretty awesome. I was very excited when I saw that little bit of news come out, because I really wanted one of these rifles, and I have one. All right, guys, I think that covers a lot of the history stuff from the comments section. Let's go ahead and get into the features of this rifle, as far as how things have changed or things that were specifically addressed in the comments section. First off, this barrel. So I remember when these rifles were first getting imported, and these are the first Zastava arms ever to have chrome lined bores. That was a huge topic of discussion. Why were previous Zastava rifles not chrome lined? What was the deal with that? And there was a couple of theories out there. One was that they didn't have sufficient deposits of chromium, which doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you really wanted chromium, you could find a way to get chromium. Another was that they didn't necessarily have the expertise in order to be able to chrome line bores, maybe the equipment or whatever. Again, I find that a weird reason to not do chrome lining. If you don't know how to chrome line, go ahead and get a hold of the materials and the expertise and whatever, the advisors, in order to be able to teach you how to chrome line. But regardless, that was the narrative at the time. That was the trend in the firearms community, that those were the possible reasons, and no one was for sure. What I've seen pop up most recently with the recent importation of the ZPAP underfolder, which I'm very interested in and would love to get my hands on, a lot of people, and I've also seen it in my comment section as well, a lot of people are saying that the original rifles were not chrome lined because the barrel steel was just that good. You didn't have to worry about it. The hardness of that steel was just as such that chrome lining was unnecessary. And I find that a really weird justification. It's maybe more plausible than the others, but yes, hardened steel at the appropriate hardness will withstand wear. So perhaps, 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel, that's good steel. That's stuff that is at its base is going to better resist barrel erosion from shooting and all that kind of stuff. But what chrome lining also does, in addition to preserving, breaking down friction and stuff like that, it also resists corrosive salts from corrosive primers, causing your bore to start to get pitted and waste away that way. Barrel hardness isn't necessarily going to do that as well. It's better to have some sort of barrier between it and the barrel, so that's where chrome lining comes in at that point. Now, chrome lining will not indefinitely protect your bore, but it will delay the destruction, give you more opportunity to be able to get to a cleaning kit and be able to restore your weapon to appropriate functional status. So I find it very weird that apparently the answer was, we'll just go this brute force direction and just harden the barrel better, when that wasn't really going to do a lot for corrosive ammunition. Now, in the current state of things, for most people, corrosive ammunition is not going to be that big of an issue. We're not seeing a large importation of surplus 762x39 that is probably corrosively primed. We're primarily seeing civilian produced stuff that is no longer corrosively primed. So like your Tula, current production Wolf and all that kind of stuff doesn't have corrosive primers in it. So really, to the average consumer, whether or not this is chrome lined doesn't really matter. But I find it interesting that the narrative has shifted in the past couple of years. The groupthink that is the YouTube and honestly any social media firearms community. All right, this rail. This is the Ultimac rail. There's a lot of questions about that. Apparently I said it too fast or something like that in the original video. I'll also spell that out at the bottom of your screen now. The Ultimac. This is the Ultimac rail. So far, I've had no issues with this rail. I don't necessarily do a lot of like mag dumps and stuff like that. And even so, most of the time, whenever it is that I'm like seriously running this rifle, I wear gloves and stuff like that. So I've noticed no real issue with the heat. Somebody in the comments section said they either had an H2 or a T2 on one of these and was having no issue with heat affecting that optic. However, that is a very expensive and well-made aim point product. So maybe take that with a grain of salt. If you have put an optic on your Ultimac, go ahead and let me know in the comment section how many rounds you have on it and what optic. And let us know if you've had any issues. Now on here, I have this thorntail mount. This is a thorntail. Somebody in the comment section recommended that I use a thorntail mount for this, and I have. Paired with this Surefire M620. Now the issue with the Surefire M620 and the thorntail is that they make a cantilever version of the thorntail that gets the light a little bit further forward. However, they don't make that for the 620 because the 620 is a pretty old light. There's not a lot of people still producing stuff for the M620. It's kind of been superseded in the Surefire product catalog. Now, in the current placement, this light does light up my front sight post. So that I don't necessarily love, and at some point I will wind up having to swap this out. I will probably get like a different Surefire, like an M600 or an M300 or something along those lines, and probably a 600 that have a longer body so that as I move it forward with the appropriate cantilever thorntail mount, I'll still be able to get a hold of my clicky cap. But that's what I'm looking at doing at some point in the future, and this is, yeah, the thorntail. Okay, so that's our handguard area. What about our optic on this UTG side rail? So let's start off with the optic here. Right now, I think I'm still running this on solar. I think I'm about to switch it over to manual, specifically because when shooting in daylight, when you have like a lot of bright sunlight, the dot's too bright. And if you're wanting to be able to switch between like doing precision work and doing like close range drills and stuff like that, you want a little bit more control over your reticle brightness. So like the other day, it's summer now, it's been very bright and sunny outside, and my dot was huge. It was almost to the point of blooming with the amount of light that I was getting in. So I would like to, I'm gonna finally make that switch away from running this primarily solar. Now this mount, I actually have a little bit of a complaint with this UTG mount right now. And that is, I was having some issue getting accuracy results with this rifle, and I was getting really confused. Like, why are my shots going all over the place? What is happening right now? And I was cleaning the rifle and I noticed that this optics mount was a little loose. So I looked at the bottom here and there's actually a tensioning screw right there that is retained. So I retensioned it, got this thing nice and tight, checked the zero again, which did need a minor amount of adjustment, and then finally managed to be able to get this thing to somewhat properly group on paper. Now, in addition to that, the optics mount, as we can see here, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's a little bit of light above that dust cover there. And that's kind of one of those things where you might have to deal with that whenever it is that you do the side saddle mount. But if this was just a little bit lower, I would have a little bit easier time getting on the optic. So I do, and you can kind of see it here, I do have to kind of like, first off, I'm getting more of a chin weld, but I also kind of have to cock my neck into an interesting position. A lot of that has to do with the stock length, as well as the height of the optic. It's not so bad when I'm standing. It's not so bad when I'm like driving the rifle and all that kind of stuff. But I really notice it when I'm shooting on a bench and I'm trying to like get settled in behind a bag and all that kind of stuff. This is not terribly comfortable to shoot in that way. So something to take into account there. I do want to talk about the safety real quick. So it's wonderful that this has this bolt hold open notch in the safety. However, it is very easy to unintentionally release that. Like if, I lock it back, I set it down on, the shooting bench and stuff like that in order to be able to call clear so we can go check our hits, and the bolt will fly forward. Because that all has to do with the tensioning of the safety itself. So you kind of run into an issue with AK safeties where you want them tensioned to where they don't necessarily fall down so easily, but you also need them loose enough to be able to like actually actuate them very easily, sweep them. So you gotta find that middle ground, and one of the issues there, of course, is if you make them too loose or like the right amount of loose and you try to lock that bolt back, there's a lot of spring tension still on that bolt, so that like it doesn't take much to be able to get the ball rolling on that bolt coming forward. Now, something I forgot to mention in the previous video was stock attachment. So we see here we have this triangle stock. This is not a side folder, and we can see our screw right here. Now, on a standard AK, there's a tang that protrudes from the rear trunnion that has 1 or 2 screws in it, and that's how you do your stock attachment on a standard AK. This threads into the rear trunnion in a similar like attachment to a shotgun stock. So this is like a wood stock. You'd actually have to remove the butt pad, and then you'd be able to get access to the screw, just like a shotgun. So that's kind of interesting. It's neither here nor there. It's just one of those things where like this will not take standard AK or AKM furniture because it has a completely different mounting process for it. All right, guys. That's features. How has it been shooting? All right, guys, so in the last couple of years, I have had some interesting opportunities with this rifle. So for a little bit, I was moonlighting with a local shooting course. The instructor there was working on his own, and I would come out occasionally to be kind of like a guest co-instructor or assistant instructor and stuff like that. Just pro bono work. I enjoy shooting. I enjoy being around people who are active in shooting, and he's a really good dude that I wanted to support. Had some spare time, didn't have anything else going on. Now, he decided one day that he was going to host a stress shoot, and stress shoots are one of my absolute favorite types of firearms training. I love getting the heart rate up and then trying to see where your point of diminishing return is so that you can better aim your training, your conditioning, all that kind of stuff in order to be able to exceed that. He was going to have a fairly good sized class of like almost 30 people, so he wound up bringing myself and then also the local SWAT team captain in to assist with the course so that we'd have some like additional lane safeties and stuff like that in order to make sure that as people were pushing their limits, their boundaries, that they wouldn't necessarily like do something silly to hurt themselves or others. So I brought this rifle out and my kit and all that kind of stuff. And the whole thing was supposed to be scaled towards whatever it is that we wanted to bring out. So if you just wanted to bring out, your pistol belt, or you wanted to bring out a chest rig, or you wanted to run full armor, it didn't matter. All of it was supposed to be about what you wanted to test for yourself to see what you needed to do. And we did a whole bunch of different, high-speed drills and stuff like that, some stuff to get the heart pumping and all that type of thing. And one thing that you may not necessarily appreciate when you're a student in these types of courses is how little the instructors get to shoot. So you can wind up coming out there with, I brought over 200 rounds that day, and I hardly shot anything. I shot more handgun than I did rifle. However, we did finish off with what is referred to as the Hilltop Humbler, which I've shown a couple times on the channel previously. I've run 4 rifles now through that particular course of fire, and it's going through different positions, different types of positional shooting from awkward positions and stuff like that, which is some of my favorite type of technical shooting. And then sprinting from position to position, again, to keep that heart rate up and all that kind of stuff. And I brought this rifle along. Fortunately, I have no video, because also when you're instructing, it can be difficult to be able to get video of what it is that's going on. I did get some stills though. And I remember not having too much issue with going through the course of fire with this rifle. You got 1 shot per target, and I seem to remember clearing the course of fire just fine. Now, also, I have been, of course, shooting this for groups here lately. I did finally manage to get a group strung together, and that I forgot to bring out here with me, so I'll roll in a picture now. But it wound up being a 6-inch group, and I do think, so like I said, I've been having some issue with even getting this thing on paper. I was getting more of like a shotgun pattern of stuff, not even necessarily all landing on paper. So as soon as I finally got a group, I called it good. And then a lot of that's also, I blame 124 grain 7.62x39 FMJ. I don't consider that to be a good load. It's my least favorite, and I've definitely found it to be the least accurate out of pretty much all of my rifles. However, I finally got this 6-inch group, and you see those 2 flyers way up there at the top. The 3-shot cluster is about 2 7/8 inches, which is pretty impressive. And I think also, some of that could also be this reticle getting too much light and that dot being too big, where really if you're trying to do precision type shooting with a red dot, you want to make that to where you almost can't see it, to where you just have enough to be able to see it on the target, but you don't want it to obscure the target. So I might have been having some issue with being able to maintain a precise sight picture, but that is what happens whenever it is that you're evaluating rifles in the format that you would choose to run them in, because we on this channel do not have a rotational grouping optic that I put on all the guns and stuff like that. We run guns however it is that they're set up. So right now this is coming in at 6 inches with 123 grain Barnaul. I am 100% confident that it can do better. I had other stuff that I had to accomplish on this range day, so I had to pretty much take what it is that I had. As soon as I had a workable group, that's what we were going with. Now, reliability, I've had absolutely no reliability issues. Of course, it's an AK, duh. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the shooting portion of this particular video. Why don't we go ahead and get into my recommendations? Would I recommend this for a duty type rifle? If you're law enforcement, not so much. There's a very negative connotation associated with AKs, so I don't know if I would necessarily recommend this for at least US law enforcement. If you were some sort of military contractor or something like that, I don't know if you would necessarily get a hold of a ZPAP that would meet with your needs, but an M70 would be right up your alley at that point, depending on where it is that you're going and what it is that you're doing. I would not be upset to be armed with an M70. If you were talking about, this is kind of a new category within the duty type setup, but if you're talking about an armed citizen, absolutely. The AK has been supporting the life and liberty of armed citizens across the world for decades now. So this would be a fantastic choice. And I roll this kind of life and liberty gun, armed citizen thing, Minuteman, if you will, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But I roll that into the duty weapon side of things because that's where I feel like those features and stuff, the duty set of features, is what that type of person is going to want on their rifle, so that they can do duty type things in the capacity of a concerned armed militia. What about as a home defense, self-defense rifle? This setup is fairly short, especially if like you break it down a little bit and stuff like that. So I could understand running this in a vehicle. It would not be my first choice. I prefer to see folding stocks and stuff like that whenever it comes to truck guns. But if you wanted to, it's handy enough to be able to do it with. As a home defense gun, it really depends on the home. If you live in an apartment or something like that, 7.62x3.9 has a tendency to over-penetrate, and especially through like barriers and stuff like that. So maybe not necessarily the best choice. But like in my situation in my home, all the bedrooms are upstairs. So if I just hold the top of the staircase, I'm shooting down into the subfloor. Well, I'm sure whatever's down in the subfloor would not like to be shot, you know, AC unit and stuff like that. It would be better than me having rounds skittering down the street or something like that, potentially, you know, shooting up somebody else's house. So that's something to take into account there. What about as a hunting rifle? Kind of depends on your local and state laws and stuff like that. I don't think this would be the worst pig rifle or varmint rifle of some sort. And the 7.62x3.9 is perfectly adequate for any of your medium-sized games. So, you know, getting into like deer and stuff like that, this would perform just fine in that capacity. As long as, like, speaking of capacity, probably gonna have to run like 10-round mags or something like that. Okay. What about as a competition gun? This would not be my first choice unless you were running in a dedicated AK competition, like Kalash Bash, which Clayco, I think it's Clayco 47, shoots those all the time. Great AK channel, if you guys haven't checked it out before. He can run an AK like no other. So yeah, if you were running in a AK, like AK purpose built competition, then yes, I would 100% recommend this, especially since like you don't necessarily have to get a whole new handguard on here in order to be able to kind of get a little bit more splayed out of the rifle and be able to drive that muzzle and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely would recommend this for an AK competition. But if you're running this up against like ARs, I would not recommend this. You know, obviously, if this is your life and liberty gun or your defensive gun and you want to be able to run it in that way to be able to train with it, yes, absolutely, take it to a competition. But if you're talking about a dedicated competition rifle, this would not be my first choice. A more streamlined manual of arms on like the AR-15 is what I would prefer to see at that point. Okay, well, what about as a woods gun? Well, if you're talking about like hiking with it, no, I don't think a rifle's a good choice for that. But if you're talking about like throwing this across like an ATV or, you know, whatever UTV or whatever, you know, Gator, whatever it is that you have, yes, this would be perfectly fine to be able to take pop shots at stumps or, you know, handle whatever predator that you might run across in the 2- or 4-legged variety. I wouldn't necessarily want to take this against something large like bear, because I do think by volume of fire the 7.62x3.9 would eventually put down a bear, but I would definitely prefer to see something more powerful that would do it more efficiently. Okay, so those are my recommendations. What are my uses for this rifle? This is my more like bare bones AK option in my arsenal, something that I work around so that I better understand the intricacies of working around an AK. So it's not necessarily like my go-to fighting rifle or anything along those lines, but I'm not opposed to the idea of fighting with it either. I am keeping a closer eye on this UTG mount though. That's something that I might withdraw my endorsement of this particular optics mount. We'll see how time goes on. We'll see if it loosens up again and if it gives me any additional issues, and I'll let you guys know if that happens. All right, guys, what about competitive options out on the market? Well, if you're wanting to stay in the AK variant side of things, then I would recommend this Galil Ace. Previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. This is the Generation 1. They also have a Generation 2 out, which I like this. I'm not necessarily falling all over myself to replace this with a Generation 2, but I will say that the Generation 2 has some really good features to it, and I would highly encourage you to check out a Galil Ace for that type of purpose. So this is a little bit better set up for, you know, out of the box for modern optics and lights and all that kind of stuff. I had to make more adjustments to the ZPAP in order to be able to do the same. I do have the telescoping inside folding stock and all that kind of stuff. Offside charging handle. Like, there's a lot of very positive things that come out of having this type of AK variant. If you're wanting to go more mainstream AK, then perhaps you would want to look at like a Kalashnikov USA AK, anything out of their product line. Now, last I checked, those rifles were flying off the shelves pretty rapidly, but I don't know, things could have changed since between now and then. So I guess we'll just you'll have to check. You know, that type of stuff's always an ebb and flow whenever it comes to whether or not those rifles are still If they're overpriced, the only place if you can only find them at higher than MSRP, I would definitely not recommend buying them. I don't think anything is worth paying over MSRP. But if you do manage to find one for a pretty good deal and it's in stock, like that sounds like a pretty good combination if you're looking to scratch that AK itch, which right now I am so badly wanting to scratch the AK itch again. I want another. I've been thinking about it like nonstop for a really long time. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.